In a small, crumbling hut, a woman named Alina labored through the night, her screams piercing the stillness. Her husband, Torin, stood by, his face etched with worry, not for her pain, but for the whispers of the village elders who had warned of omens. When the baby finally emerged, a hush fell over the room. The child was alive, squalling with a fierce vitality, but his skin was unlike anything they had ever seen. It shimmered with an unnatural hue, a deep, mottled purple that seemed to shift in the flickering lamplight, like the surface of a storm-tossed sea. Alina clutched the child to her chest, her breath catching as she traced the strange patterns with trembling fingers. Torin, however, recoiled. "What is this?" he hissed, his voice low and sharp. "This is no child of ours. This is a curse." The village had long held superstitions about signs and portents, and a child marked so strangely could only mean ruin. The elders had spoken of such things, babies born under ill stars, harbingers of famine or plague. Torin's eyes darkened with fear and disgust. "It cannot stay here," he declared, his voice final. Alina wept, her pleas swallowed by the wind as Torin tore the baby from her arms. She clawed at him, her nails drawing blood, but he was unyielding. "The village will turn on us," he growled. "They'll say we brought this upon them. Do you want us cast out or worse?" That night, under the cover of darkness, Torin carried the child to the edge of the forest, where the trees grew thick and twisted, their branches clawing at the sky. He set the bundle down on a bed of moss, the baby's cries echoing faintly as he turned away. "Forgive us," he muttered, though the words felt hollow. By morning the child was gone from their lives, and Alina's sobs were the only sound left in the hut. Miles away beyond the forest's tangled heart, lay a barren stretch of land where a poor couple, Mara and Elias, eked out a meager existence. Their hut was little more than a skeleton of wood and straw, patched together with hope and desperation. For years they had prayed for a child, their arms empty and their hearts heavier with each passing season. Mara's hands were rough from tending their pitiful garden, and Elias's back was bent from hauling stones for a pittance. They had nothing, no wealth, no kin, no future, only each other and a quiet, stubborn faith that kept them going. That morning, as the sun crept over the horizon, Elias set out to gather firewood. The forest was a place of whispers and shadows, and he moved quickly, his breath fogging in the chill air. Then he heard it, a sound so faint he thought it was the wind at first. A cry. He froze, his heart thudding. Following the sound, he pushed through brambles and thorns until he stumbled upon the mossy clearing. There, wrapped in a tattered cloth, was the baby. His skin glowed with that eerie purple sheen, but to Elias, it was not a curse, it was a miracle. He scooped the child into his arms, marveling at the warmth of the tiny body against his chest. "Mara," he shouted as he ran back, his voice breaking with joy. "Mara, come quick." Mara stumbled out of the hut, her eyes wide as Elias held up the child. She gasped, reaching out with trembling hands. "Where did you find him?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she cradled the baby. "The forest," Elias said simply, his own eyes glistening. "Someone left him there." Mara didn't care about the strange color of his skin or the questions that hung unspoken between them. To her he was perfect. They named him Kael, after the old word for light, for he seemed to bring a spark into their dim world. Little did they know, this child, cast away like refuse, would soon become the axis on which their fates would turn. But back in the village, Torin and Alina's lives began to unravel. The crops they had tended withered overnight, their leaves curling black as if scorched. The cow they relied on for milk grew sick, its udders dry. Whispers spread among the villagers, dark glances cast their way. They angered the spirits, some said. They kept a cursed thing too long. Torin drank heavily, his guilt gnawing at him, while Alina stared into the fire each night, her arms empty, her mind haunted by the child they had abandoned. The forest kept its secrets, and the wind carried no answers, only the faint, fading echo of a baby's cry. The years slipped by like water through a cracked jug, and in the humble hut of Mara and Elias, Kael grew. His skin remained that strange, shifting purple, a hue that caught the light in ways that defied explanation, sometimes deep as twilight, sometimes bright as amethyst. The villagers in their sparse corner of the world whispered about him, some with fear, others with curiosity, but Mara and Elias shielded him with a fierce, quiet love. They had no riches to offer, no fine clothes or grand tales, but they gave him warmth, a roof, and a name that carried their hope. To them, Kael was not a burden or an omen, he was their son. As Kael grew, so did the whispers of something extraordinary. It began small, almost unnoticed. The garden behind their hut, once a patchy sprawl of wilted greens, began to thrive. Tomatoes swelled red and heavy, beans climbed higher than the roof, and herbs sprouted with a fragrance that drew neighbors from miles away. Elias, who had never caught more than a handful of fish in the muddy creek, hauled in nets so full they nearly tore. Mara's woven baskets, once crude and simple, sold for twice their worth at the market, her hands seeming to move with a new, uncanny skill. The couple marveled at these changes, their eyes often drifting to Kael, who played in the dirt with a quiet intensity, his small fingers tracing patterns no one could decipher. By the time Kael was 7, their fortunes had shifted beyond reason. A traveling merchant, struck by the quality of Mara's weaving, offered a pouch of silver coins, more than they had seen in a lifetime. Elias stumbled upon a vein of quartz while digging a new well, and soon traders came bartering for the shimmering stones. The hut, once a crumbling shell, grew sturdy with new timber and a proper chimney. Neighbors began to call it the blessed house, though some muttered darker things under their breath. "It's the boy," they said, eyeing Kael's strange skin. "He's not natural." But Mara and Elias paid no mind. They laughed and sang, their voices carrying over the fields, and Kael's bright eyes followed them everywhere, a silent anchor to their joy. Yet fortune is a fickle guest, and its shadow loomed unseen. As their wealth grew, so did their desires. Mara dreamed of fine dresses and a grand table laden with feasts. Elias spoke of hiring hands to work the land, of building a house with stone walls and glass windows. They began to see Kael not as their miracle, but as a means, a key to a life they had never dared imagine. And then, one spring, a miracle of a different kind arrived. Mara, who had long accepted her barrenness, felt a flutter in her womb. By winter she bore twins, a boy and a girl, pink-skinned and ordinary, with wails that filled the hut with a new kind of light. The twins, Lyra and Tobin, became the center of their world. Mara cooed over their soft cheeks, Elias carved them tiny wooden toys, and the hut rang with their laughter. Kael, now 10, watched from the edges, his purple skin a stark contrast to their rosy glow. At first, the shift was subtle, a sharper tone when Mara called him to chores, a dismissive wave from Elias when Kael offered to help. But as the twins grew, so did the distance. "Stay out of the sun, Kael," Mara would snap, her eyes lingering on his skin with something like unease. "You'll scare the little ones." Elias began to mutter about proper children, and blood of our own, his voice low but cutting. Kael felt the change like a stone in his chest. He worked harder, tending the garden alone, hauling water until his hands bled, hoping to reclaim the love he had once known. But the more he tried, the colder they grew. One night, as a storm rattled the shutters, he overheard them by the fire. "He's not like us," Elias said, his voice thick with ale. "Never was. Look at him, purple as a bruise. What if he's the reason the twins cry at night?" Mara sighed, her tone weary. "He brought us luck, yes, but we have our own now. Maybe it's time he fends for himself." The word struck Kael like a blade. He slipped outside, the rain soaking his clothes, and stared into the dark. The garden still bloomed, the creek still ran full, but the warmth of the hut was gone. He was 12 when they first struck him. A sharp slap from Elias for spilling milk, a shove from Mara when he lingered too close to the twins. By 13 he was sleeping in the shed, his meal scraps tossed out like charity. The villagers noticed, their whispers turning to pity, but none dared interfere. Kael's eyes, once bright, grew dull, and the patterns he traced in the dirt became jagged, angry lines. Back in the village where he was born, Torin and Alina's ruin had deepened. Their fields lay fallow, their livestock dead, their neighbors shunning them as cursed. Torin drank himself into stupors, while Alina wandered the forest's edge, calling for a child she could no longer name. The wind carried no answers, only the rustle of leaves and the distant echo of a life discarded. And in the blessed house, the seeds of its own undoing were quietly taking root. The air grew heavy in the house of Mara and Elias, thick with unspoken resentment and the sharp tang of neglect. Kael, now 15, had become a shadow in his own home, a tall, wiry figure with that strange purple skin, moving silently through chores that no one thanked him for. The shed where he slept was a damp, drafty prison, its walls patched with moss and regret. The twins, Lyra and Tobin, now 5, giggled and played in the fields, their rosy cheeks a stark contrast to Kael's muted presence. They had been taught to fear him, to flinch at his touch, and their wide eyes followed him with a mix of curiosity and unease. Mara and Elias, flush with wealth and pride, barely glanced his way anymore, their affection reserved for their true children. The fortune that Kael had brought still lingered, but its edges were fraying. The garden yielded less each season, the tomatoes smaller, the beans brittle. The creek's fish grew scarce, and the quartz vein Elias had once mined dwindled to dust. The couple blamed the weather, the soil, the fickle whims of trade, anything but the boy they had pushed to the margins. Yet the villagers saw it differently. "It's him," they murmured, nodding toward Kael as he hauled water or mended fences. "He's the luck. You don't cast aside a gift like that." But Mara and Elias, drunk on their newfound status, dismissed the talk as jealousy. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with streaks of fire, everything shattered. Kael had been repairing a cartwheel in the yard when Tobin toddled too close, tripping over a stone. The boy wailed, a thin cut blooming red on his knee, and Elias stormed out, his face twisted with rage. "What did you do?" he roared, seizing Kael by the arm. "I didn't," Kael began, but Elias's fist silenced him, striking his jaw with a sickening crack. Mara rushed out, cradling Tobin, and glared at Kael as if he were a stranger. "You're a menace," she spat. "Look at you, freakish, unnatural. Get out. We don't need you anymore." Kael stumbled back, blood trickling from his lip, his eyes burning with a pain deeper than the blow. He looked at the house, the sturdy walls he'd helped build, the garden he'd tended, and saw only rejection. Without a word, he turned and walked into the dusk, his footsteps fading into the forest's embrace. The wind howled behind him as if mourning his departure, and the night swallowed him whole. The next morning the cracks began to show. The garden withered overnight, leaves curling black as if kissed by frost. The creek dried to a trickle, its bed a graveyard of cracked mud. The merchant who had promised Mara a fortune for her latest weaving vanished without a trace, leaving her with a pile of unsold cloth. Elias's tools broke, one by one, splintering in his hands as he cursed the fates. The twins fell ill, their laughter replaced by feverish whimpers, their skin paling despite the tonics Mara brewed. The villagers watched from afar, their whispers growing louder. "They drove him away," they said. "The blessed house is cursed now." Weeks turned to months, and the decline sharpened into ruin. The sturdy walls of the house sagged, rain seeping through the roof. The silver coins they'd hoarded dwindled, spent on doctors who shook their heads and left empty-handed. Lyra's cough grew wet and ragged, Tobin's eyes sank into hollow sockets, and Mara's hands trembled as she rocked them, her voice cracking with desperate lullabies. Elias took to pacing the fields, shouting at the sky, but the sky offered no mercy. Their pride crumbled like the walls around them, and in its place grew a gnawing dread. "It's him," Elias muttered one night, his voice hoarse. "It was always him." Mara wept, clutching the twins' fevered bodies. "We were wrong," she whispered. "We threw away our luck." The realization settled like a stone in their guts. Kael, the boy they'd scorned, had been the thread holding their world together. Now with him gone, that thread had snapped, and the fabric of their lives unraveled. They resolved to find him, to beg forgiveness, though they scarcely knew where to begin. The forest loomed vast and unforgiving, its shadows hiding the boy they had cast out. Meanwhile Kael wandered. He slept beneath trees, drank from streams and ate what the wild offered, berries, roots, the occasional fish. His purple skin blended with the twilight, making him a ghost among the leaves. He felt no anger, only a hollow ache, a longing for the family that had once been his. The forest seemed to cradle him, its whispers softer than the voices he'd left behind. He didn't know that miles away Torin and Elena still haunted their own edges, their lives a mirror of ruin. Nor did he know that Mara and Elias, driven by desperation, were beginning to search for him, their footsteps tentative but determined. The wind carried no promises, only the rustle of a world shifting, waiting for the pieces to fall back into place. The forest stretched endless and wild, a labyrinth of gnarled roots and whispering leaves that swallowed Kael whole. At 17 he was lean and hardened, his purple skin now a map of scars and resilience, etched by thorns and time. He had carved a life from the wilderness, shelters of woven branches, snares for rabbits, a quiet rhythm of survival. The ache of rejection still lingered, a dull pulse beneath his ribs, but he had learned to bury it deep, letting the forest's embrace fill the void. The trees seemed to know him, their shadows bending to shield him from the sun, their roots guiding him to hidden springs. He was alone but not lost, not yet. Far beyond the forest's heart, Mara and Elias stumbled through their own descent. The blessed house was a husk now, its roof caved in, its walls crumbling under the weight of neglect. The twins, Lyra and Tobin, clung to life by threads, their breaths shallow and ragged, their once bright eyes clouded with sickness. The garden was a wasteland, the creek a dry scar, and the villagers had turned their backs, whispering of curses and retribution. Mara's hands, once skilled at weaving, shook as she spooned thin broth into the twins' mouths, her tears mixing with the gruel. Elias, hollow-eyed and gaunt, roamed the fields, muttering Kael's name like a prayer, or a plea. "We have to find him," Mara said one night, her voice raw. The fire sputtered, casting long shadows across the ruined room. Elias nodded, his jaw tight. "He's out there. I feel it." They had no map, no plan, only desperation driving them into the forest's jaws. They left the twins with a neighbor, an old woman who clucked her tongue and warned them of folly, and set out at dawn, their boots sinking into the damp earth. The wind howled, tugging at their cloaks, and the trees loomed like sentinels, guarding secrets they could not decipher. Days bled into weeks. They called Kael's name until their throats bled, their voices swallowed by the vastness. Thorns tore at their skin, hunger gnawed at their bellies, and doubt clawed at their resolve. "What if he's dead?" Elias rasped, slumped against a tree. Mara shook her head, her eyes fierce. "He's alive. I know it." She clung to that certainty, a lifeline in the dark. And then, one evening as the sun bled red across the horizon, they saw it, a flicker of purple through the trees. Kael stood by a stream, his back to them, washing a fish he'd caught. His hair was longer, wilder, but that shimmering skin was unmistakable. "Kael?" Mara's cry broke the silence, sharp and desperate. He froze, his shoulders tensing, then turned slowly. His eyes, once soft with trust, were hard now, guarded. Elias stepped forward, hands outstretched. "We've come to find you." His voice cracked. "We were wrong." Kael said nothing, his gaze shifting between them, taking in their ragged clothes, their hollow faces. Mara fell to her knees, sobbing. "Please, Kael. The twins are dying. Everything's gone. We didn't know, we didn't see what you were to us." Kael's jaw tightened, memories flashing behind his eyes, the warmth of their early years, the sting of their rejection, the cold nights in the shed. "You threw me away," he said, his voice low, steady. "Like I was nothing." Elias sank beside Mara, his head bowed. "We were fools. Greedy, blind fools. We thought our luck was ours to keep, but it was you. It was always you." They begged, their words tumbling over each other, a torrent of regret and shame. Kael watched, silent, the fish slipping from his hands into the stream. Back in the village of his birth, Torin and Alina's lives had crumbled to ash. Their hut was a ruin, their bodies frail, their minds haunted by a child they could no longer picture. The forest separated their story from Kael's, a divide neither knew how to cross. But here, by the stream, a different reckoning unfolded. Kael's heart warred with itself, anger against forgiveness, pain against pity. He looked at Mara and Elias, broken and pleading, and saw not the tyrants who had cast him out, but the frail humans who had once held him close. "I'll come," he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "For the twins. Not for you." They nodded, tears streaming, and led him back through the forest, their steps lighter despite their exhaustion. When they reached the village, the old woman gasped at Kael's return, and the twins stirred as he entered the room. He knelt beside them, his hands hovering over their fevered brows, and something shifted. The air grew warm, the garden outside twitched with new green, and the creek gurgled faintly in the distance. Lyra's cough eased, Tobin's eyes fluttered open, and color crept back into their cheeks. Mara and Elias wept anew, clutching Kael's hands, their apologies endless. He stayed, not out of duty, but because the forest had taught him what they could not, that roots, once broken, could still grow anew. The house mended, slowly as did their bond, fragile but real. The villagers spoke of miracles, and Kael's purple skin became a legend, a symbol of grace forged in the crucible of pain. The wind carried their story far, a folktale whispered in the dark, of a child discarded, found, lost, and redeemed.
Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on your notification if you enjoyed the story. Thank you for watching. See you next time.